Jake knew something was off the moment he stepped onto his porch that morning. The sun was barely up, casting a hazy golden light over his farm, but something didn't feel right. The usual sounds of morning, the distant mooing of his bulls, the rustling of chickens in the coop, the gentle breeze swaying the barn doors, were all there. Yet there was an eerie silence beyond his fence. Then he saw it. His gate. His own damn gate, locked with a massive, industrial-strength padlock that definitely didn't belong to him. And there, standing on the other side of it, arms crossed, smug as a cat in a sunbeam, was Karen. "Well, well, well. Looks like you're stuck," she said, her voice dripping with that condescending sweetness she always used when she was about to cause trouble. Jake's stomach twisted with a mix of confusion and amusement. Stuck? On his own land? That was a new one. He stepped down off the porch, crunching across the gravel driveway toward the locked gate. The thick chain wound through the metal bars, secured tightly with the brand-new lock. A note was taped to it, written in her distinct, aggressively neat handwriting. "Maybe now you'll learn to be a considerate neighbor. Karen." Jake let out a slow breath, trying to keep his temper in check. He knew exactly what this was about. Karen, the self-appointed queen of their little community, had been on a personal mission to civilize his farm ever since she moved into the fancy HOA neighborhood just a stone's throw away. She complained about everything. His bulls were too loud, his barn was an eyesore, and don't even get her started on the smell. She wanted his farm gone, or at least modified to meet her ridiculous, suburbanite standards. "You really did it this time, huh, Karen?" he called out, shaking his head. "You broke onto my property just to lock me in? You do realize this is illegal, right?" Karen scoffed, flipping her blonde bob over one shoulder. "Oh, please, Jake. It's not illegal if it's for the greater good. This is just a lesson. A little taste of what it's like when someone disrupts your life." Jake almost laughed at the sheer audacity. He could hear the self-righteousness radiating off her like heat off pavement. But then, something caught his eye. Movement. Just beyond the locked gate, inside the pasture, inside the bullpen, Karen had strolled in without a care in the world. His stomach dropped. "Karen," he said slowly, his amusement fading. "Where exactly are you standing right now?" Karen arched a perfectly plucked brow. "I walked in through the side. You always leave that little latch open. Maybe if you were more responsible." Jake's eyes flicked past her, and he immediately stopped listening. Because there, not 10 feet behind her, stood Thunder and Storm, his two biggest, most territorial bulls. Massive creatures, thick with muscle, their dark coats glistening in the morning light. They weren't aggressive by nature, but they didn't like strangers. Especially ones flailing their arms and raising their voice. And Karen? Karen was very much flailing her arms. Jake fought the urge to panic, not for himself, but for her. She had no clue what kind of trouble she'd just stepped into. "Karen," he said, as calmly as he could manage, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't move. Don't scream. And for the love of everything holy, don't turn around too fast." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare me, Jake. You always act like your farm is some kind of dangerous jungle. This is exactly why." Then she heard it. The deep, thunderous snort of an animal weighing over 1,000 pounds shifting its weight behind her. Karen's body went rigid. Jake watched as realization slowly seeped into her expression. Her bravado melted away, replaced by something much more satisfying, fear. "Jake," she whispered, her voice suddenly very small. "What's behind me?" "Just 2 of my biggest bulls," Jake said, now grinning despite himself. "And they don't like strangers." Karen's breath hitched. Her eyes darted to the side, probably trying to glimpse them without turning too fast. But it was too late. Thunder stomped a hoof, his massive frame shifting with unmistakable agitation. Karen did exactly what Jake told her not to do. She screamed. The sound ripped through the quiet morning like a siren, high-pitched and panicked. And just like that, Thunder and Storm reacted. A deep, aggressive snort came from behind her, followed by the unmistakable sound of hooves digging into the dirt. Jake barely had time to process what was happening before Karen bolted, her high heels slipping in the mud as she tried to run. But the thing about bulls? They love a chase. Jake leaned on the fence, arms crossed, watching as the most entitled woman in town was now sprinting in sheer terror across his pasture, two massive bulls following close behind. They weren't exactly charging at her, but they were curious, and Karen, in her panic, was doing exactly what not to do around large animals, running like prey. She tried to climb onto a wooden post, but it was too slick with morning dew. She slipped and landed flat on her back with an oomph, sending dust flying. Jake winced, but not from sympathy. Then, just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, Karen made the ultimate mistake. In her desperation, she scrambled toward another section of the fence and climbed over into the next pen, the one with Gus. Gus was not like Thunder and Storm. Gus was mean. An old, ornery bull with a bad attitude and zero patience for nonsense. As soon as Karen hit the ground, Gus lifted his massive head, nostrils flaring. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Oh, Karen. You really did it now." Karen, now fully in fight-or-flight mode, didn't notice Gus at first. But she noticed when he let out a deep, earth-shaking grunt and took a slow, deliberate step toward her. She froze. There was a beat of silence. Then, in the most Karen move possible, she turned to Jake and shrieked, "Do something!" Jake couldn't hold it in anymore. He laughed. A full, chest-shaking laugh that echoed across the farm. "Oh, I will," he called back. "But first, you might want to start climbing, because Gus is not as patient as the other two." Karen barely had time to glare at him before Gus lowered his head and charged. With a sound that could only be described as an undignified squawk, Karen threw herself at the nearest tree, scrambling up the trunk like a panicked cat. Gus skidded to a stop beneath her, snorting in irritation. And just like that, the self-righteous, ever-complaining, padlock-wielding Karen was stuck, perched in a tree, covered in dirt, surrounded by three very unhappy bulls. Jake took one last sip of his coffee, grinning as he leaned on the fence. This was better than any revenge he could have planned. And he wasn't letting her out anytime soon. Karen clung to the tree like her life depended on it because at this point it did. Gus stood below, nostrils flaring, pawing at the dirt as if daring her to come down. Thunder and Storm had calmed down slightly, but they still lingered nearby, their hulking frames casting long shadows across the pasture. Karen, who had spent years terrorizing Jake with HOA complaints, was now reduced to a dirt-covered mess, trembling like a leaf, her designer blouse torn and smeared with mud. Jake had seen a lot of things on his farm, but this was a masterpiece. He crossed his arms, casually leaning against the fence as he watched Karen's legs shake from exhaustion. She was stuck up there, too terrified to move, but too stubborn to admit she needed help. "You know, Karen," Jake called out, barely containing his amusement, "I gotta say, locking me in was a bold move. But locking yourself in? That's some next-level planning right there." Karen shot him a glare so fierce it could have melted steel. "This is not funny, Jake. Get them away from me." Jake pretended to consider it. "Well, technically, you locked yourself in. And technically, you're trespassing. So I feel like this is more of a you problem." Karen let out a frustrated noise that was somewhere between a scream and a whimper. She shifted slightly, trying to find a more stable position on the branch, but Gus let out a deep grunt, making her freeze again. "This is your fault," she shrieked. "Your farm is a disaster waiting to happen. Who keeps wild animals like this?" Jake let out a laugh. "Karen, these are bulls. You moved into farm country and act surprised when there are farm animals? That's like moving to the ocean and complaining about the waves." Karen ignored him, frantically looking around for an escape. "Call animal control. Call the sheriff. Call someone." Jake pulled out his phone, pretending to consider her demand. "You know I could do that. But then I'd have to explain how you illegally locked my gate, trespassed onto private property, and harassed my livestock. Pretty sure that'd land you in more trouble than me." Karen's face paled. She must have realized that no matter how much she whined, she was on the losing side of this one. For the first time since she moved into the neighborhood, she wasn't in control. And that was driving her mad. Jake watched as she tried to come up with a new plan. He could almost hear the gears turning in her head. Finally, she settled on her go-to move, playing the victim. "Jake," she said, her voice suddenly softer, more pitiful. "Please. I'm scared. I could fall. My ankle hurts. I think I twisted it." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You climbed that tree like a squirrel, Karen. I don't think your ankle's that bad." Karen sniffled dramatically. "You don't understand. This is serious. I could get hurt." Jake sighed, rubbing his chin. "All right. I'll make you a deal. I'll get you out of there, but only if you agree to stop messing with my farm. No more complaints, no more HOA nonsense, and no more trying to force me to change how I run things." Karen hesitated. Her pride was clashing with her fear, and Jake could see the internal battle happening right on her face. She wanted out of this mess, but admitting defeat? That was a tough pill for her to swallow. "Fine," she spat, though it was clear it physically pained her to say it. "Just get me down." Jake grinned, tipping his hat back. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" He stepped into the pen, making a clicking noise with his tongue. Gus flicked his ears, clearly not in the mood to move. Karen whimpered as the bull turned his head toward Jake, eyes still sharp with irritation. "Come on, old man," Jake muttered, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small handful of treats, a mix of grains and molasses. Gus, for all his grumpiness, was easily bribed when food was involved. The bull snorted but took a few steps away, following Jake toward the other side of the pen. Karen let out a shaky breath, inching her way down the tree. Her arms and legs wobbled, but she managed to make it to the ground without face-planting. The moment her feet hit the dirt, she bolted toward the fence, scrambling over it in a way that was anything but graceful. She tumbled over the top, landing in an unceremonious heap on the other side. Jake watched with mild amusement as she sat there, panting, her hair a mess, her expensive clothes covered in mud and leaves. He had never seen her look so disheveled in all the time he'd known her. "You good?" he asked, biting back a laugh. Karen shot him a glare, dusting herself off. "I hate this place." Jake shrugged. "Guess that makes us even, since this place hates you right back." Karen stomped toward the locked gate, only to remember the padlock she had so confidently placed there earlier. She let out a groan of frustration. "Where's the key?" she demanded. Jake smirked. "I don't know. You're the one who locked it." Karen's face twisted with rage. "You are insufferable." Jake walked up, taking his sweet time unlocking the gate. "You know, Karen, I feel like this is a great life lesson for you. Actions have consequences. Maybe next time, don't try to teach people a lesson unless you're sure you're not the one who's gonna end up learning it instead." Karen didn't respond. She just stormed past him the moment the gate swung open, muttering something under her breath that Jake was sure wasn't friendly. She limped her way toward her perfectly manicured neighborhood, her once pristine outfit now ruined, her reputation in tatters. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time Karen would try something, but at least for now, she had been humbled. And if she ever got the idea to pull another stunt like this? Well, there was always the pigpen. With that, Jake turned back toward his farm, chuckling to himself as he walked back to finish his morning coffee. Jake had seen plenty of entitled people in his life, but Karen took the crown. Even after the complete disaster she had brought upon herself, he knew she wouldn't just let it go. People like her never did. They didn't see themselves as the problem. They always had an excuse, always had a reason why it wasn't their fault. As she limped away, covered in dirt, he could almost hear the gears turning in her head, already plotting some way to twist the story in her favor. But Jake had one thing she didn't: proof. After making sure his bulls were calm and back to grazing, he walked toward his security camera mounted on the barn. He tapped into the footage and replayed everything from that morning. The moment she marched onto his property, locked his gate, and walked right into the pasture like she owned the place. Every second of her arrogance, her screams, her scramble up that tree was recorded in crystal-clear detail. He grinned, already imagining how the HOA would react when they saw this. By the time he finished his morning chores, word had already started to spread. Small towns had a way of making news travel at lightning speed, and Karen's farmyard fiasco was no exception. He got a call from his friend Pete at the general store, who was already chuckling about the whole thing. "Jake, tell me it's true. Karen locked herself in with your bulls, and nearly got trampled." Jake laughed. "Not only is it true, but I've got the footage to prove it." Pete howled with laughter. "Oh man. You've got to show that at the next town meeting. People have been waiting for someone to put her in her place." Jake wasn't usually one for public humiliation, but Karen had gone too far. She'd broken onto his property, tried to control his livelihood, and nearly got herself killed in the process. If she was going to play the victim, he was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what had happened. As expected, it didn't take long before the HOA got involved. That afternoon, Jake got an email from the president of the Homeowners Association requesting a meeting to discuss the incident that had taken place. He smirked. He knew exactly how this would go. Karen had probably stormed into their office, spinning some dramatic tale about how his wild, dangerous farm had attacked her. What she didn't realize was that Jake was always 3 steps ahead. When he walked into the HOA's meeting room the next day, Karen was already there, sitting with her arms crossed, her face still carrying traces of the embarrassment she had suffered. She shot him a glare as he took a seat across from her. The HOA president, a middle-aged woman named Linda, cleared her throat. "Jake, Karen has brought forth a serious complaint about the safety of your farm. She claims she was violently chased by your bulls after being locked inside your property." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Did she tell you she was the one who locked herself inside?" Linda frowned. "Karen said it was an accident." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "An accident? That's interesting. Because I have video proof showing her deliberately padlocking my gate and trespassing onto my land." Karen's face turned a shade paler. That's not relevant. The point is, your bulls are a danger to the community." Jake ignored her and pulled out his phone, connecting it to the screen in the room. He pressed play, and the footage spoke for itself. The video captured everything. The way Karen smugly locked his gate, her taunts, her careless stroll into the pasture, and, of course, the moment she realized she was trapped with the bulls. The best part was her shriek of terror as she scrambled up the tree. The room fell silent as the video ended. Then, Pete, who had tagged along to watch the show, let out a loud laugh. "Well, I'd say that settles it." Linda sighed, rubbing her temples. "Karen, this is not what you described to us." Karen's face burned red. "I was scared. Those bulls could have killed me." Jake leaned forward. "And why do you think that happened? Maybe because you locked yourself inside and started waving your arms around like a lunatic?" Linda nodded. "Jake's right, Karen. You trespassed, you caused this situation, and you're lucky you didn't get seriously hurt. We cannot support this complaint." Karen looked like she was about to explode. But he... Linda cut her off. "Karen, the HOA does not have authority over Jake's farm. We've told you this before. It's private property, and his livestock is legally protected. If you have a problem with the farm, you should consider moving somewhere else." Jake had never seen Karen speechless before, but there she was, mouth opening and closing like a fish. She had lost. Not only had her plan backfired, but now she had publicly embarrassed herself in front of the very people she always tried to control. It was poetic justice at its finest. As the meeting ended, Karen stormed out without another word. Jake, Pete, and a few of the other attendees lingered, still grinning over how beautifully everything had played out. "I've got to say, Jake," Pete said, clapping him on the back, "I think you just did this town a huge favor." Jake shrugged. She had it coming. Over the next few days, the fallout was even better than he could have imagined. The video had made its way around town, and Karen's reputation took a serious hit. People who once tolerated her constant meddling were now openly laughing about her misadventure. The HOA, now realizing she was more of a liability than an asset, removed her from any unofficial positions of power she had assigned herself. The best part? Karen, utterly humiliated, started keeping her distance. No more surprise visits. No more demands. No more HOA letters shoved into his mailbox at ungodly hours. It was the peace he had been waiting for. To celebrate, Jake decided to host a barbecue. He invited his friends, neighbors who had supported him, and even some of the HOA members who had finally seen Karen for what she was. There was music, laughter, and the smell of grilled ribs filling the air. As he flipped a burger on the grill, Pete nudged him. "Think she'll show up?" Jake smirked, glancing toward Karen's house in the distance. The curtains were drawn, and there wasn't a single sign of movement. Not a chance. And that, to him, was the best victory of all.